All right. Welcome, guys, to my screenplay analysis of The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. This is one of my favorite movies, and I chose it because I am currently working in the fantasy genre. So, first, let's look at the main protagonists of the film. The two main protagonists that I chose were Frodo Baggins, here on the right, and Samwise Gamgee, here on the left. Now, The Fellowship of the Ring and the movie trilogy as a whole has a lot of protagonists, a lot of characters that contribute to the story and the plot. I feel like Frodo and Sam are the ones that contribute the most, and I feel like the story really centers around them. Firstly, for anyone who's seen the movie, Frodo is the one who carries the One Ring. He's the one who has to deal with that burden. Throughout the entire film, he is constantly burdened with it, and the entire plot really revolves around him because the entire plot revolves around destroying the One Ring. Samwise, on the other hand, while not the main protagonist, he is definitely one of the lead characters, and I feel like he contributes the most to helping Frodo accomplish his quest. Because not just throughout the Fellowship of the Ring, but throughout the entire trilogy, Samwise is always there for Frodo, no matter what. There are many incidences within the Fellowship of the Ring and the entire trilogy in which Samwise saves Frodo, gets him out of a situation. For example, at the end of the Fellowship of the Ring, Samwise tries to follow Frodo onto the boat, and Samwise can't swim. So he goes to the bottom of the water, begins to drown, and then Frodo pulls him out of the water. And at the very end of the trilogy, when they're at Mount Doom, Frodo almost falls into the volcano, but Samwise grabs him and saves him. And these two main protagonists, Frodo's want, his overall want is, and same with Sam, their overall want is to just be able to get the quest done and go home. Go back to the Shire. Hobbits love the Shire, and that's their overall want. Their overall need, honestly, I feel like their need is just about the same as their want. Samwise really, he gets the most joy out of helping others, and he's very kind and sweet, and he's definitely the epitome of a loyal friend. And many people in the Lord of the Rings fan base argue that Samwise is actually the main protagonist, the main hero. But I would argue otherwise. Frodo's main need is, most of all, he wants to get rid of this burden, and he wants to finish and get rid of the One Ring. And I feel like that's definitely a sort of need that a lot of the characters in the trilogy really want. And in terms of secondary protagonists, there's a lot of protagonists in this film, a lot of characters that you could argue are protagonists. But the rest of the Fellowship do contribute greatly to the film. If any one of these characters was not in the film, then it would dramatically affect the story. And throughout the film, each of these characters contributes something very important, and they're all extremely important. For example, Gandalf guides Frodo the entire way through the Fellowship of the Ring, and when Frodo is feeling doubtful, Gandalf reassures him with his wisdom. And the rest of the Fellowship, they have their own roles. They all cheer up everybody. And yeah, those are the main protagonists that I chose. It was a little difficult just because of the sheer amount of them, but yeah. And now for the antagonists. This one was much easier to determine. I would say that the two main antagonists of the film are Sauron and the One Ring. Now, I understand that the One Ring is not really a character, but it is definitely an antagonistic force that is almost anyone who knows the lore behind the Lord of the Rings knows that the One Ring is basically an extension of Sauron himself, and the One Ring has its own mind, it has its own consciousness. Throughout the entire film, it has a terribly corrupting influence on all the people that it touches. A good example of this is Boromir, and many times throughout the film, Boromir seems to succumb to the corruption and almost gives in. And at the very end of the film, he tries to take the ring from Frodo, and this is one of the larger events in the film. And Sauron, obviously, he was the one who made the ring. Most people would agree that he's the main antagonist, and of course, just like with the protagonists, we have secondary antagonists, which are other sort of not primary, but definitely notable characters or forces that are detrimental to Frodo and Sam's quest. For example, the Balrog, which attacks the Fellowship in Moria and subsequently kills Gandalf, as well as the many orcs and goblins that we see, the 9 Nazgul, including the Witch King. The Uruk-hai and Lurtz, which attack the Fellowship towards the end of the film, and Lurtz ends up killing Boromir, is definitely another large event. Saruman the White, the once good wizard that succumbed to the ring's corrupting influence, and all of these characters, while definitely secondary antagonists, definitely create a large contribution to the story. And in terms of the stakes, external stakes are fairly obvious. I mean, obviously, if Sauron wins and claims the One Ring, he will have his full power. He'll be able to conquer Middle-earth and extinguish all good from the world. And, of course, if this happens, the protagonist and anyone who is a protagonist will probably die or be enslaved. And during the sequence when the Fellowship is in Lorien, after they escape from Moria, Galadriel speaks to Frodo and shows him a vision of what may come to pass if he fails. And, of course, this is one of the visions that he sees is the hobbits enslaved and the Shire is burning. And internal stakes are a little different. Obviously, we do have the corrupting influence of the One Ring. Whoever has the One Ring for extended periods of time will eventually start to show signs of its corruption on them. And while hobbits like Frodo and Sam are generally very resistant to the corruption, throughout the entire film and the rest of the trilogy, Frodo really, you can really tell that it's taking a heavy toll on him. And this is especially apparent when you have characters like Boromir, which are easily influenced by it and attempt to take it. And while Gollum does not have he has a very small presence in the Fellowship of the Ring, it definitely applies to him as well. Secondly, the quest, a massive quest, which is very long, definitely has a mental toll on the characters, especially Frodo and Aragorn. It really sort of takes a toll on them over time. And then obviously, just like up here, the hobbits and anyone else's fear of their home being destroyed, but especially the hobbits, because the Shire is so important to them. It's symbolic to their nature. It's a symbol of purity in the story and happiness. And then Aragorn's fear of his home kingdom, Gondor, falling to Sauron. And this is also what drives Aragorn to sort of go from an outcast ranger and nobody to eventually, in the third film, ascending to the throne of Gondor and taking his place among his brethren. And in terms of dominant values and underdog values, I would say that the overall dominant values in this film are strength and hatred, power, fear, and corruption. Now, it's definitely sort of a thing, and J.R.R. Tolkien, the writer of the Lord of the Rings, definitely there's a heavy his Christian values are heavily apparent in the trilogy, and so this is really understood when you sort of look at the characters. For example, you've got like Sauron, who is arguably the most powerful being in Middle Earth, and this really sort of shows. And you've got characters like Saruman and Boromir, which succumb to corruption, and while Boromir does overcome it in the end and redeem himself, it's definitely a very strong factor. Fear, the Nazgul are a good example of this. The Nazgul are very good at inciting fear. But when we look at the scene on Weathertop where Aragorn fights them off single-handedly, this really just goes to show that, for the most part, the Nazgul are all bark and no bite. And he really has the courage to sort of stand up to this onslaught. And the underdog values, we have love, hope, courage, faith, and perseverance. And these are all very apparent in the film. I would say that courage and perseverance are definitely the most apparent ones. For example, throughout the entire film, even though Gandalf dies, Frodo gets stabbed by a Morgul blade, Boromir dies, the Fellowship gets broken, and he's just alone with Sam, he perseveres. He perseveres as well as the entire Fellowship, even though they know that their quest is one that's most likely not going to succeed. They persevere because they know that that's all they can do, and they have the faith to strive on and keep going, as well as the hope. And the Fellowship, there's a really strong bond between them in which love is very apparent. For example, Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas have this sort of amazing brotherhood that they develop in the film. And this is especially apparent in the next film in the trilogy, The Two Towers, but it definitely applies here very much too. And the main plot points. I know there's a lot of text here, but I'm going to go over it real quick. So I would say that the 6 main plot points, the first one is where Gandalf arrives in the Shire, and then Bilbo leaves the ring to Frodo. Gandalf and Frodo discover that the ring is the infamous One Ring, and Gandalf also learns that the Nazgul are on their way to find it. So this is obviously a very scary event, and so he quickly pushes Frodo to leave and go to Rivendell, where it will be safe for the time being. The second point in the story that's significant is that during Frodo and the Hobbit's journey to Rivendell, they are attacked by the Nazgul, and they make it to the town of Bree. Gandalf told Frodo to meet him there, but during this time, Gandalf is captured by Saruman and is not available. Therefore, some events happen, and Frodo ends up accidentally putting on the ring, alerting the Nazgul to his presence there. Strider, which is Aragorn, joins them, and he knows of their quest and what's at stake. He takes up his duty and takes them to Rivendell, escorts them to Rivendell safely. However, before they get there, they camp at Weathertop, and the Nazgul, the Witch King, stabs Frodo with a Morgul blade, mortally wounding him. And this is a wound that can only be healed by the magic of the elves. So now they really have to go to Rivendell. The third point in the plot is that after arriving there, Frodo is healed, Gandalf arrives and apologizes for being late. And then the Elrond, the Elf Lord, tells them of the situation and calls forth many different characters from the other parts of the world to discuss what should be done. And so Legolas and Boromir and Gimli arrive as well, and they form the Fellowship. They all volunteer to go destroy the One Ring. And then at this point, for the fourth main point in the plot, the Fellowship leave, and they can't go through the pass of Caradhras or the Gap of Rohan because it's blocked by Saruman's forces. So Frodo decides to go to the Doors of Durin and pass through Moria. Unbeknownst to them, Moria is no longer occupied by dwarves and has been taken over by goblins and the infamous Balrog, Durin's Bane. As they make their way through, Gandalf and the Balrog fight. They fall down, a very long fight ensues, and they both die. However, this isn't the end, and the Fellowship leaves. They're able to leave due to his sacrifice. They make their way to Lorien, which is the fifth point in the plot. After they reach Lorien, they encounter Galadriel, which is the queen of the elves, and she sort of consoles them and gives them wisdom and information about what they should do next. And of course, she also gives them gifts, and even though they're emotionally and physically battered, they leave and make their way towards Amon Hen, which is another point. And the final point of the film. Once they reach Amon Hen, they're camping out. Boromir tries to take the ring from Frodo, and of course this does not end well. Frodo puts on the ring and disappears. And subsequently, Boromir realizes his mistake. And although Boromir is an easily corruptible guy, he is a good guy at heart, and he understands his mistake. And at this point, the Uruk-hai show up, and they begin attacking and trying to search for the hobbits, because they know that one of the hobbits is carrying the ring. Boromir decides that he needs to redeem himself for trying to take the ring from Frodo, and so he then defends Merry and Pippin against the Uruk-hai. Unfortunately, he is shot with 3 arrows in the process by the Uruk-hai captain Lurtz, and he falls. At this point, Merry and Pippin are captured by the Uruk-hai and taken away. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli manage to fight off the remaining Uruks after they leave, and then fortunately Frodo and Sam are able to escape to the other side of the river, and then they comfort Gimli, Legolas, and Aragorn comfort Boromir as he dies. And then from there, they notice that Frodo and Sam have left, and they understand that it's no longer their quest, and their duty now is to rescue Merry and Pippin. And that is the last point in the story. It's definitely a good ending for the first part of the trilogy. And now for the opening and closing images of the film. For the opening image, we have a vision of the past, which is narrated by Galadriel, and it is it's one of the most iconic intro scenes in any fantasy movie, and it basically gives a historical background to the events of the film. And although the lore of the Lord of the Rings is very large and might be intimidating for someone who is unfamiliar with it, it gives a good grasp on what happened before, where the ring came from, what it is, who Sauron is. And apart from the amazing visuals, it really gives a good sort of jump right into the fantasy world, and it helps set up the plot, and it's just a great overall opening image. Now for the closing image of the film, this is of course after Sam and Frodo escape across the river, and they now know that it's just them, and it's their duty to finish the quest. And at the very end of the film, just before the closing credits, they are standing on this rocky precipice overlooking the dead marshes and Mordor in the distance. Sam and Frodo have a wholehearted conversation, and Sam reassures Frodo that they're going to see the Fellowship again. And then they descend the rocky cliff, and then they begin their next journey, and that's when the film ends. It has a sort of sense of loneliness as well as sort of a sense of hopelessness in a way, even though the characters are still persevering, they still have hope in their hearts, and they still have the courage to continue. And that's really where another place where those prime core underdog values are really sort of demonstrated. And it's just an overall great closing image to the film. And that's it.